Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I am doing a series review for the Great Tree of Avalon series by T.A. Barron. So this is a trilogy that is technically not really a trilogy anymore because it was kind of lumped in with another series. So T.A. Barron has a series that is called like The Lost Years of Merlin or something like that, which I think is a 7-book series, and then he wrote this series as a follow-up trilogy. When I read it the first time, because this was a reread for me, it was a trilogy, but now the books have actually been re-released as part of like a continuation of the Merlin series. So these are actually technically considered like the last 3 books in that series. But I'm just going to be talking about these as a trilogy because that is how I originally read them and how I reread them this time. Because I'm not actually a huge fan of the original series, I just like this trilogy. The Avalon trilogy consists of the first book, The Great Tree of Avalon, Child of the Dark Prophecy, the second book, The Great Tree of Avalon, Shadows on the Stars, and the final book, The Great Tree of Avalon, The Eternal Flame, which this one has my favorite cover out of all of them because these are beautiful colors. So as I said, this was a reread for me. This series is one that has been a favorite of mine for a very long time. I first read it in 2004, which I know because actually in the back of the book, apparently I have written down the dates of every time that I have read this book, which is really cool. I forgot that I had done that. So I read this for the first time in 2004, and this is actually like the 4th or 5th time that I have reread it. This is a series that I came back to many times over the years, and I have really enjoyed it. I guess I should explain what it's about. So this is a story about Avalon, obviously, but this is about Avalon after all of the events of King Arthur have happened. Merlin no longer visits Avalon anymore, and he's just sort of part of their mythology at this point. But Avalon is quite literally a giant tree, and all of the people who live in Avalon and all of the creatures who live in Avalon live on the roots of Avalon. So each of the roots has a kind of elemental characteristic. So there is stone root, fire root, air root, water root, and so on and so forth. There are lots of different roots. So it is a absolutely huge tree, and they all live on the roots. The premise of the story is that there have been multiple wars in this world's history, and they have had some very dark times, but one of the darkest periods in their history was when all of the stars went out and they were in darkness. And there's a prophecy that came during that time that 2 children would be born. One would be the true heir of Merlin and would be the savior of Avalon, and the other would be the child of the dark prophecy who would destroy all of Avalon. And so many children who were born in that year were killed, or people were prevented from having children. But of course, in this story, this is 17 years after that, and our main characters, some of our main characters are children who were born during that time period, but they have to disguise the year of their birth because of the prophecy. So we follow a few main characters. The most main character is Tamwin, at least I think that's how you pronounce his name, but they call him Tam, who grew up in Fireroot with his adopted brother Scree, who is one of the Eagle folk, and they have been separated at this point. But Tamwin is kind of a jack of all trades, and he is also a wilderness guide, and he has some kind of magical backstory in his blood. The other main character that we follow is Ellie, who is an apprentice to become a priestess of the Society of a Whole, which is one of the main religions in this world. And at this point in their history, the stars had come back to light, but now they are starting to go dark once again, and they are re-entering a dark period in their history, and everyone's kind of freaking out. And they're saying that the child of the dark prophecy must be found. And there is also a bad guy who is trying to do all kinds of nefarious things. I don't really want to like spoil what they are. This has already been a long explanation of what this book is about. But this series was a lot of fun to reread for me. I really like the setting of it, especially this first book is extremely nostalgic for me. I love the society of the whole and the priests and priestesses that they have there, and the way that their environment is described, and all of the philosophies of it. This book actually has quite a lot, or this series has quite a lot to say about you know, humanity and humanity's role in the world, and how humanity protects or destroys the environment, our relationship to each other, our relationship to other creatures, what kind of responsibilities we have to them, and what kind of power over other creatures we have or what we should not have. It's a very interesting series. I think that in terms of writing style, it's a very simplistic writing style, which when I was reading this when I was younger, I think worked really well for me. It made it very accessible, and it made the ideas of it very accessible as well. At this point in my life, I am not a huge fan of the writing. It's not poorly written, but I tend to like things that have more complex writing or more lyrical writing, and this is just very kind of plain and straightforward. I think the plot line is also relatively straightforward. It's very like classical fantasy. It's a chosen one story. You know, there's a prophecy and all of that, and there's a quest. So it's not like it's necessarily anything especially groundbreaking or new, but I still find it very enjoyable. I think that especially for me, because it is so nostalgic, I do really love the world and setting of this. There are lots of different creatures. There are, you know, different kinds of nature spirits. There are elves, there are giants, there are wizards, there are priests and priestesses, there are dragons, there are shapeshifters, unicorns, people who turn into eagles, people who turn into deer, people who turn into flames. There are all kinds of different people and creatures in this series that is really fun. I think that this series, as I said, has a lot of topics that it covers that I think can be very interesting. They are presented in a very straightforward and maybe simple way, but I still think that they can be thought-provoking. I enjoyed the two main characters of this story, especially Ellie, the one who is a priestess. She actually plays the harp, which is something that I always enjoyed because I play the harp as well. And she is a very feisty character, which I enjoy, and she has a water spirit friend who travels with them, who is very grumpy but very endearing as well. And then Tamlin he's kind of a bumbling character. He's one of those characters who is kind of a derp. He's kind of bumbling, but he has a lot of potential, and he does kind of find his way over time. We get to see the story from multiple perspectives. I think that at sometimes that was really good and sometimes not as good. I liked seeing the story from both Ellie and Tamlin's point of view, and sometimes it was interesting to be able to follow Brianna, who is the elf, or Scree, who is the eagle folk person. The perspective that I did not like was that this also gives you chapters from the perspective of the bad guy, I guess, of the like evil person. And one, I thought that those were very boring chapters. I didn't really care about them at all. I didn't think that he was an especially interesting or complex villain. That's the word I was looking for. Evil person. Villain. And he's much more of just like a very stereotypical, simple villain of like, yes, I want to be evil for the sake of being evil. So it's not like the most nuanced villainy. And I kind of wish that his chapters hadn't even been there. A lot of times I would just skip his chapters because they didn't really add anything to the story or understanding it. Like, I think every time I have read these books, I end up just skipping most of the villains' chapters because they don't really add anything and they're not that interesting. So that was my main issue with the different perspectives that they had. I wish that their villain had been a little bit more complex and not as just flat I'm just gonna be evil for the sake of being evil and gaining power. In terms of the writing, I've said a couple of times that it is very simple and straightforward writing, which I think is fine. It's just not my favorite kind of writing anymore. One thing that I was not a huge fan of in the writing is that he tends to write accents into the writing, which is something that I personally don't like. I find it distracting and it just makes it more difficult to read. One thing that I think is kind of interesting about this series and sort of how it's categorized is that when I first bought this, I found it in the adult fantasy section of the bookstore. And then over time, I think it has been moved more to the YA section of the bookstore. The characters are about like 16 or 17, so that makes sense. But in terms of the way it reads, I think that this probably would be appropriate for middle grade readers, because I think it does have a simpler writing style which could make it more accessible. And not that middle grade readers are incapable of reading more complex writing, but I know that when I was that age, I enjoyed the writing of this, that it was a little bit simpler, it was a little more straightforward, and that made it more accessible to me. I think that it has a lot of ideas in it that could be really interesting to kids, and that having a more simple way of presenting those ideas could be good. And there's nothing in it in terms of like violence or romance or anything like that that would make it inappropriate for younger readers. There are some romantic interests in this story, but there's nothing in them that would make it like not appropriate for younger readers. I'm not sure if the romantic interests ever even kiss in this. It's a lot of like pining after each other kind of romance, or the kind where like they fight all the time and they're like, I hate you, but you're like, but really you're fighting because you have crushes on each other. So yeah, I think that this could definitely be a good series for middle grade readers or YA or adult, because I did enjoy it rereading it as an adult. I think I may be a little biased because this series is so nostalgic to me, but I do still enjoy it. Like, I thought that it was fun to read. The first book I gave 4 stars, and then the second book I gave 3 stars, and then I think I gave the last one like 3.5 stars. The second book is definitely my least favorite of the series, although funnily enough, it has one of my favorite quotes in it. But the second one is definitely more of a filler story and has less plot line. The first one I think is definitely the strongest of the series, but the last one isn't bad. It kind of brings it back around and ties everything up. This is not necessarily a series that I would just recommend across the board. It kind of depends on how you feel about certain tropes that it has, that it is that chosen one, you know, save the world quest kind of storyline. It has a very simple villain. It also depends on how you feel about the writing, that it is more simplistic, but it does have a very nice like nature vibe to it, and I enjoy the world that it is in. If you are a younger reader or know any younger readers who want a high fantasy story, this may be one that they could get into as well. That would be kind of an easy introduction to a high fantasy world. So that is all for my review of the Great Tree of Avalon trilogy by T.A. Barron. Let me know in the comments below if you have read this series, if you agree or disagree with what I have said about it. I would love to talk to you guys. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!